Welcome, everybody, to today's webcast. I'm your host, Nick Cavalancia from Tech Evangelism. Today's webcast, of course, is on implementing a user activity and behavior monitoring program. I'm really glad you're here today. This is a very cool topic because most of the time, I think I spend my time talking about the problems that we have around security, around insider threats, around external attacks, and so on. And very seldom do I really get the chance just to focus on here's what you need to do to sort of solve the problem to a degree, right? That's kind of the goal here. And I think, like most organizations today, you guys are probably looking for ways to significantly reduce risk, and that's obviously kind of on your plate every day. The good news is, of course, that we're all keenly aware of the threat vectors, the tactics that are used, et cetera, that we have to protect against. But in the case of your own users, sort of the bad news is it's a bit more complex than that, because you can't just, let's say, install antivirus and the problem is solved. This is a user that works within your organization, and there's a couple of reasons why I'll call them your risky employees, if you will, or at least the employees that potentially pose a risk to the organization. There's a couple reasons why they're a bit more difficult to identify proactively. And for one, risk is a shifting concept in reality within an organization, especially those of you that are in larger enterprises where you have lots of users, you have people moving around a lot, there's a lot of HR activity, that kind of thing. The risk is shifting tremendously. So you don't necessarily know when an individual poses a risk to the organization. And then secondly, the tactics by which an employee goes about, say, I don't know, like stealing data, it looks a lot like, it pretty much looks just like they're doing their job. So that becomes kind of the hard part here, and I'll talk about that a little bit on another slide here with a couple of stats here. And so the question becomes, what kind of monitoring should you be implementing, and how should you go about doing it? So in today's webcast, I'm joined by Mike Peralta, Senior Systems Engineer from Veriato. He's going to show you a little bit of Veriato at the end here, but I'm going to talk about the why, the who, and the how to implement a user activity and behavior monitoring program. Now, as always, in all the webinars that I do, I love as interactive as I can get of a webinar. So if you've got questions along the way, stick them in the Q&A box. If you've got a comment, put that in there too. I've got the control panel over here open on the right. I'm happy to look at those questions, even try to answer them as we go along. We will have a time for Q&A at the end as well. So by all means, if you have questions, comments, jokes, anecdotes, whatever it is you want to share while we're doing this presentation today, by all means, stick those in there. I'll try to make this as interactive as I possibly can. So let's jump into the first slide here, which is sort of why you should monitor employee activity in the first place. Now, I've got a couple of stats, just 4 of them that I want to cover, that sort of makes the case about why you should monitor employee activity. The first one I'm actually just going to start with here is that you can see up here 25%, a quarter of all data breaches, they involve insiders, and they're actually insider based. Now, this data point comes from Verizon's data breach investigations report. There's a quick link to it. This is the one from 2017, just came out in I guess April of last year. If you're not reading this report, you need to be reading this report every single year. You can see in the little screenshot there, it's the 10th edition. Usually comes out around March to April of every year, and they tend to have tens of thousands of incidents as their base of deciding what actually happens, what data breaches look like. And if you know anything about statistics, if you had, I think last year's was like 67,000 incidents. If you have that many samples in your database and your sample size, you have a statistically relevant sample size that basically at this size represents the entire industry, because these are worldwide incidents. They break them down by country, I mean, all kinds of stuff. It's really great by industry, et cetera, et cetera. So the first thing is, a quarter of your incidents involve insiders or caused by insiders. Now you might say, well, Nick, so what? That means 75% are all external people, and so why are we talking about employees? Well, the reality is, at the same time, in this same report here, all these stats come from the same report. You can see here that 81%, so almost a real solid majority of data breaches involve the misuse of credentials. So I like to say it this way. I like to say that eventually every external attack looks like an insider threat. Think about that for a second. If 81% are going to involve the misuse of some credentials, one way or the other, meaning an external attacker is going to leverage an inside credential, and they're going to suddenly look like a user, right? And so even though it's not an insider that's doing the work, it still looks like one. And so what are you monitoring? You're monitoring your insiders. So that's kind of the idea here. you see here that the number one method of discovery is third party. This is another big issue. It's really, really tough to discover when there's a data breach, when there's fraud being committed, especially when it's insiders, because it's really tough to tell that they're doing something that's not part of their job. I'll share a story that happened a couple years back. I live in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. It's currently 55 degrees here, but I am still wearing shorts and flip-flops because it's a law in Florida that you must wear shorts and flip-flops to work. And just north of me in West Palm Beach, about an hour north, there was a story about a woman that worked in the HR department for Palm Beach County. I'm not sure what department of Palm Beach County, but Palm Beach County. And she decided she was working with somebody in cahoots in Jacksonville, Florida, which is about 5 hours north of here by car, about an hour by plane. And was going to basically take screenshots and print them out of people's personnel records that include their social security number, and then was going to give them to the person in Jacksonville, and those people were going to go and try and open up credit cards and accounts and that kind of thing and steal their identity. And so what she decided to do was she had to send them up to Jacksonville, and I guess didn't want to email them or whatever. And rather than using just the postal service, she went to the UPS store. And this whole thing just doesn't make any sense to me, but okay. So she went to the UPS store and wanted to next day air it to Jacksonville when you could just send it USPS, with a simple stamp and get there by tomorrow anyways. And of course the UPS store has to ask what's in there in the envelope, because there's certain things they can't send, like drugs and other stuff. And the woman's answer was a little shady. And so the UPS store employee both has the right, based on their contract with the person doing the shipping, and the obligation legally to double check if they think that something is suspect. And so they opened it up, saw these sheets of paper with social security numbers on it, and they called the Palm Beach County sheriffs, and the woman got arrested. So back to my point here, third party, the sheriff and the UPS store actually found the data breach. It wasn't anybody inside Palm Beach County. They didn't know that because one was just kind of doing their job. She was just print screening something, and that's something that's entirely out of the ordinary, or maybe printing a record or whatever she did. But the number one discovery method is third party. And then the other bad thing that goes along with this is you can see here this huge percentage, 82% of the breaches, it's months or years. So at a minimum, it's a month, because that's technically still in the months category. But even if it took a month, if a data breach happened a month ago, it's a lot of time where a lot of things have happened, like maybe the employees have left, that data has been now utilized, been shared, been sold, whatever the case is, and it takes years or months to discover. Fraud is the same thing. If I remember correctly, the last time I read the ACFE's fraud report, it was something like 6 months to detect fraud on the average. It was ridiculous. So this is one of the reasons why you need to be watching employee activity, because they have the potential, they have access to already to your key information, intellectual property, sales data, financial data, and so on. And since they're involved with 25% of the breaches, and again, the external attackers are leveraging credentials, this is something where you need to be a lot more proactive, because as you can tell, when these kinds of things happen, using the last two bullets here on this slide here, it's very likely that you're just not going to know that it's going to happen, or when you do figure out that it's happened, it's a long time from the actual activity itself. So let me do this. What I want to do is, as we're talking about employee activity and putting a program in place, I want to ask you guys just a quick poll. I'm going to stick up here on the screen. You go ahead and interact with the screen directly, and go ahead and check one or more of these as is appropriate here. And basically what I'm just trying to get a sense of is what's your greatest concerns around monitoring employees. We're going to talk about two different methodologies of monitoring employees here, but is it around the issue of remote employees? Is it trying to identify a threat early on, or as proactive as you possibly can? Is it knowing what you should be looking for? Erica says, my screen is black. It shouldn't be. You should be seeing a quick poll pop up on the screen. That's really strange. I'm not sure what to tell you, Erica, but I am reading the screen at least, so maybe you can interact with this. I'm hoping you can see my slides though as well. So knowing what threat actions to look for is what actually defines a threatening action, and how do you look for that specifically? Maybe that's one of your issues here. And then the last one there is maintaining employee privacy as well. Looks like I've got about 42% of you have voted. So I'm gonna leave that up for another 15, 20 seconds or something like that. Feel free to check one or more of those boxes. And by the way, if you have a different greatest concern, if you will, or one that's not mentioned in here, stick it into the Q&A box. I'm interested in what other kind of factors come into play. And my goal here is to try to tailor the conversation a bit as I'm going through these slides that I prepared, but try to make sure I tailor it to your concerns? What are really the issues that you're really thinking about as you're putting this in place? So feel free to put something in the Q&A box just saying, I'm concerned about X, whatever it is. So it looks like I've got 80% of you that have voted. That's actually a really high percentage for a webinar, so I'm really appreciative of that. Most people, they just don't poll. So I do appreciate that. So I'm gonna go ahead and close the poll, and I will share the results with you guys so you can see that here. And Erica, hopefully you can see this as well. Looks like for 2/3 of you, identifying threats early is the #1 answer, followed by employee privacy. I'll talk a little bit about that today. And then the last two are shared with about 1/3 of you, maybe not the same third, but knowing what actions to look for, as well as the issue of remote employees, because obviously you can't see what they're doing if they're sitting at home. You know, they're just sitting on the couch watching TV anyways. I know that I do. I'm just teasing. I work for a living, unlike most people. But anyway, so let's talk about getting into how to actually build a program. And the first one is to figure out who actually needs to be involved in this. And I've got 5 different parts of the organization that need to be involved here for certain. And this isn't a concrete list like only these people, but this is definitely a set of people that definitely need to be involved. The first one is senior management. You're gonna be putting a piece of software in place that records everything a user does, or is at least analyzing everything that they do. And so you need buy-in from the top down. There's a lot of organizations that then might face some backlash from their employees. So it's something that IT doesn't just want to go and put in place. So this really needs to involve senior management, especially as I go through some of the other details that are involved in what you're going to be doing to implement this program. You're going to have to be asking some of these people for their input to make sure that the way it's implemented, everyone has given you thumbs up. Everyone's good with it and no other concerns and so on. So senior management's the first one. Human resources, definitely, because they're going to be involved with things like if there is actually a potential threat or potential data breach, whatever it is, might be identified. HR might need to be involved with things like, let's bring somebody in, let's talk to them. There's also some proactive measures that HR is going to become involved with around like an acceptable use policy, what's considered a I'm going blank here for a second here. A CIPA, which is your confidential intellectual property agreement, which I'll talk about in about 2 slides. So HR is going to get involved as well, both sort of proactively and reactively if there is an issue. Legal has to be involved because you are watching employees, you are recording things. There could be lawsuits in both directions based on an employee action, meaning the employee might be suing the company or company might be suing the employee, depending on whatever happens. Those kind of things do happen. So legal needs to be involved if you have a legal department, especially those of you in the enterprise. And then, of course, IT. I'm assuming most of you are in the IT world, and so that being the case, you're the ones implementing a solution like this, helping shortlist one, put one in place, that kind of thing. This is pretty much something that you're not gonna be able to do on your own. Really, really tough. You can do some stuff with like a SIM solution, consolidation of logs, that kind of thing, maybe web logs, but you're not gonna really get the context that you need if you're not using some kind of third-party solution. And then the last one is a security team, and they might be necessary from the standpoint of ensuring that someone is leveraging correct access. They also have to be involved to shut someone's access off, and in the case that an incident is spotted, it's kind of real-time incident response, that sort of thing. So you've got, I'm covering at kind of a high level really quick, but Erica, she says, I'm again back to black screen. Sorry about that, the polling results, but now to a black screen. Erica, why don't you drop off and come back in? That's the only thing I can suggest right now. And I'm with you. I really want to make sure you get something out of this. Luckily, my slides are kind of light on content. It's just a couple of bullets, so you're not missing anything. So if you do come back in, don't feel like you're missing these amazing graphics. I didn't make amazing graphics. It's mostly just words on the screen. And we'll be happy to get you a copy of the deck if you need to. But try jumping out and jumping back in, or just sit back and listen, one or the other. But I want to make sure you get the most you can out of this webcast. So you've got to get at least these 5 groups involved in a room discussing how we're going to do this. I'm going to walk through these steps here. The first step I've got is the idea of, if I can click on the screen, there we go, determine your goals. And so I've got here on the right-hand side real quick here that there's a number of threat actions you should be considering as you're thinking about your goals. So you can kind of read that on your own on the right. I'm not going to cover that. But and think about the goals. The first goal that you should be having is the fact that you want to detect, if I can get this to work right, there we go, detect an insider threat. That's the first goal. Normally for most people. You have to determine whether all of these are the ones that you have for you or not, but I want to detect an insider threat as early as is humanly possible. In some cases, before they actually ever perform the threat action, and that is actually possible. There are leading indicators, and those things can be used to help stop a threat. And I don't mean in that lame kind of, well, if they only copy a couple files and I stop them there, then they wouldn't have actually copied a whole bunch more files. I don't mean that early. I actually mean early indicators like changes in behavior, changes in the way they communicate, logging on at a really strange time. I mean, the real leading indicators where they're doing things that have nothing yet to do with the threat action, but they help identify, statistically speaking, and in reference to comparison against their own activity, that they might actually be almost on the cusp of performing a threat action. The next one is discover inadvertent breaches. This is one where maybe somebody performs an action where they weren't trying to cause a breach, but they have, and an example here would be, and this is not necessarily something that even like Veriato's software, even though I don't work for them, but I'm very familiar with their software, this isn't something that they would necessarily do. But as an example, a number of breaches have been caused by someone taking a data set, let's say a user base, email addresses and that kind of thing, and contact information, and accidentally exposing it out to the web. And then someone finds it on the web and pulls down, 150 million of your accounts, that kind of thing. Those are those kinds of inadvertent breaches where someone wasn't maliciously trying to do something, but that's another goal that you might have in your organization. Identifying what we would consider malicious activity. And this kind of goes back to one of the poll questions where, you talked about knowing what threat actions to work for. About a third of you said that, and knowing what is considered malicious and how to identify that. And that, of course, is more of a reactive kind of a detection thing where it's happening and we want to know that it's happening. So that's good. That's another one. And then the last one I've got here is to enhance your investigative abilities. Typically, when you think of, let's say, forensics tools, some of you may even have some forensics tools. Those tools are all reactive. They are trying to go back in time and look. Basically, for example, they might look at all of your web browser history, right? They're trying to look at and back in time and figure out what were you doing based on the current state of, let's say, a given machine. And one of the goals with really having a user activity and behavior monitoring program in place, you're doing all this proactively. You're watching things as they happen. So it really enhances the ability to investigate, because you're not trying to guess based on forensics evidence like, well, gee, there's a thumbprint here in this room, so therefore that person must have been in this room. See, that sort of forensics mentality. This is more like, let's put a video camera in the room and then we actually have a recording of everybody who walked in and out, because we were proactively in that room anyways with a camera. And so it's a very different way of doing it. And again, you look at those different types of threat actions on the right, and those help kind of tailor which of these goals, one or more of them, that you want to be utilizing. So that's the first thing. You have to determine what your goals are. You leverage that team on the previous slide to help figure out, as an organization, what are we trying to do. The next one is review your CIPA and your acceptable use policy. I'll walk through both of these real quick. The CIPA is your confidentiality and intellectual property agreement. This is a document. It ends up usually being a couple of pages, and what it's doing is it's basically spelling out to the employee, this is what's ours as far as information goes, and this is how you're allowed to interact with it, and this is our expectation of how you're going to work with it, and then what you're going to do. For example, even one of the things that's in here that gets used as part of a program like this is it defines even not just, hey, this kind of proper information is ours, and if you have any question, the default is it's ours, but it also spells out things like when you leave, you're expected to return any copies, you're expected to destroy any digital copies you may have of anything anywhere. I mean, things like that, where it spells it out and the employee signs it day one. So you have this legally binding contract with them, so that if there is a problem, let's say someone's going to leave the organization and you want to lower the risk of the exit of that employee, you come back, and as soon as they say, hey, I'm leaving in 2 weeks, meeting with HR, hey, here's the CIPA you signed. We just want to remind you of your obligations. You're here for the next 2 weeks. This is what we expect. And they go, oh, crap, I signed something. Yes, you did. And if we find out that you breached it, you're going to be in big trouble, right? So that's what the CIPA is for. The acceptable use policy here, this is something that most of you already have some kind. This is basically how users can utilize their computer system, their endpoint, what they're allowed to do online, what the expectation should be on their part around privacy, which we'll talk about in one more slide here. but it just defines basically what's acceptable and what's not. That way, if an employee is doing something that's inappropriate, utilizing company resources, which things like you're not allowed to send data up to a cloud-based storage system or something like that, you might put that in the acceptable use policy. So at least they understand it's not just you can or can't go to personal websites during work time, but it's also a little bit more than that of what kinds of things are allowed and not allowed with regard to the company's sensitive information and valuable information. The next one here is, and Erica still has a black screen, you poor thing. Well, like I said, we'll get you a slide deck afterwards. So just listen along. Again, the slides there's no graphics and fancy things flying by. I just got some bullets that are more visual indicators of what I'm talking about, Erica, so you're not missing out, don't worry. The next one here is, I mentioned the onboarding process, that having this early on. The CIPA needs to be there so the employee signed it at day one and you can utilize it upon exit. The acceptable use policy, same thing, so it's established. The moment they get onto their workstation, they know that they've at least been told what they can and can't do, what is appropriate, what isn't. And then I have also on here the fact that they've got to address disclosure, which I'm going to talk about here on the next slide here. And this is about, you have to kind of think about these two documents, specifically the acceptable use policy more than probably the other one here, whether or not you're going to disclose, and you may actually want to involve some employees. This last bullet here, kind of going back to 2 slides ago about who to involve in this process. You may want to involve some key employees. Maybe they're power users, maybe they're more trusted kind of, what I want to use, the inner circle type, users that are there to go, hey, we're thinking about doing a program like this. What are your thoughts? To try and get a sense of what's going on in the organization. Your HR department would probably be the ones that would kind of figure that out and figure out whether or not you want to involve employees. But when you're talking about addressing disclosure, which is step 3 here, and you will note on the right-hand side here, that I've got a couple of laws as examples around disclosure. There's this question just basically is, do you disclose to employees that you're putting an employee monitoring program in or not? And so I way to answer this, there's no simple answer. The answer isn't yes or no. And so I put here that you've got to figure in this balance between what's important and necessary to the employee and what's necessary to the company. And let me kind of give you an example. If you're worried about the needs of the employee, well, an employee didn't know they were being recorded and monitored, they might get pissed off and leave, right? Oh, we don't want the employees getting mad. Okay, fine, that's one aspect, that's one side. So, point 1 for the employee, if you will. But on the company side, if you're trying to figure out whether or not an employee their risk is shifting, they're now becoming a potential for a threat, or they're actually engaging in a threatening activity, you want to be able to see the natural organic behavior of that employee. And the only way to do that is to monitor them in a way where they don't know they're being monitored, right? It's like why cops, hide behind trees or whatever and are gunning on the side of the road where you don't see them. They want to see how you naturally are acting. And if you're the person that speeds down a road driving 80 and a 35, they want to write you a ticket. But if you see them all the time and they're out there all the time, then you're not going to drive 80, which, it sort of has its own merits too. So you can see the balance of maybe if you tell people they're being monitored, then they go, oh crap, I'm not going to bother trying. So got to kind of keep that in mind. And like I said here on the last one here, you might want to think about involving employees to figure about whether or not we disclose that we have a monitoring program in place. The next step, now we've kind of gotten past the what are my goals, who's going to be involved, where are we in disclosing to employees and so on. Now we're going to actually try to put some monitoring in place. So now we're getting to the nitty-gritty here of what we're actually going to be doing as far as monitoring employees. And so the fourth step is you think about choosing the modes of monitoring. The first one that I've got up here is what I'm going to call active monitoring. So this is user activity monitoring. This is something where at a tactical level, what we're doing here is we're watching every single thing that an employee does, recording it. It's an endpoint-based usually type solution that's recording I always say it this way, every email, every keystroke, every web page, every print job, every application they open, every screen, whatever, everything they do, everything, it's all recorded. So it's recording every bit of digital activity, and the use cases for it are things like, I put here investigations and forensics, because now that I have a record of what you're doing, go back to my example earlier, forensics relies on the thumbprint to prove that you were in a room, but activity monitoring in a digital sense is like putting that video camera in the room, and I can prove you, look, you walked in, you did some stuff, I can share all the things you did, and then you walked out, and I know exactly when you did it. Versus a thumbprint is like at some point in the past they were here. That's not as much context. So you have a lot more context this way. The use case for this also depends. It's sort of role based in the organization, especially for those of you in very large organizations that have a lot of employees looking for very scalable types of solutions you're putting in place. Activity monitoring is something where you're putting in place for those that have roles that you would consider high risk. And I also have high risk individuals kind of as a separate class, because they might just be people of high risk based on who they are, the way they're acting, that kind of thing. But role based. So if someone, for example, if you are in an enterprise company, as an example, and you're a bank, and you have people that have access to accounts that have a minimum of $1 million in them or something like that, you might say all of those people are sort of high risk. So we're going to be watching everything that they do. For all of you, regardless of size, maybe people that are in finance, people that are in accounts payable, maybe some people in sales that have access to more than just their own accounts. Maybe they have access to all the accounts and they can export them out and things like that. You might look at the data sets that they have access to based on their role, and you can consider them to be high risk. So something to consider there as well. And the other reason for doing activity monitoring would be kind of condition based. So I mentioned a high risk exit early on. With regard to the CIPA, and reminding somebody afterwards. If someone says, I'm leaving in 2 weeks, they're now a high risk individual, because they might have access to information. Not everyone is willing to and honorable enough to just delete the stuff that they should be deleting. Maybe they're going to take some stuff with them. I think there was an old Semantic survey that said something like 51% of employees said they'd taken intellectual property with them if they created it themselves, kind of a thing. And Veriato redid that same survey, I want to say it was 2 or 3 years ago, and came up with almost an identical. I think they came up with 52%. It was like half of users, either way, are willing to take information with them when they leave. And so that's a condition now. Now they're being terminated, or they're terminating their own position or whatever. We want to monitor what they're doing, kind of a thing. And then the other kind of monitoring that you have is what I would call passive monitoring. This is user behavior analytics. User activity monitoring was, again, the watching like everything that they do. It's like a video camera from a digital standpoint, where we're recording everything that they do on the given endpoint. User behavior analytics is very different. This is something that's being done where it's looking at an individual's behavior. So things like psycholinguistic indicators, if they change their tone from being largely positive to largely negative. If they used to use a lot of we's and us's, like we're going to get this done next quarter and whatever, to a lot of I's and me's, like I can't believe that I didn't get that job. It went very negative and went very much about me. Those kinds of things. Other behavior changes, like you never really copy files and suddenly you're copying 1,000 files, those kinds of things. This is behavior based. And this is really for both high and low risk individuals. So for those of you that are starting to think about, let's say, user activity monitoring for high risk individuals, the user behavior analytics is for everyone. And the reason why it's for everyone is, again, that risk shifts around. Take, for example, let's say an accounts payable clerk, and you would typically, because they're just a clerk, they're just somebody that issues the checks and somebody has to approve it and whatever, you normally think them as a low risk individual. But remember, with what makes them have a higher risk is if they have motive. They have some reason for needing it. It could be they have motive, they have opportunity, and they have, what's the third one? I've just forgot it. Oh, it's rationalization. Those are usually the three. Those are part of a fraud triangle that came out many, many, many years ago. But if they have motive, like I really need the money, I saw they have a gambling debt, or I got into drugs, or something changes in their life, that's a motive. They have opportunity because their accounts payable correctly. They write themselves a check, right? And the rationalization should be, oh, I never get a raise here. No one appreciates me, right? And they're starting to do this. They suddenly become a high risk individual. You don't know when that's going to happen. You don't know when the drug habit's going to start, or they run into money problems, or who knows what, right? And so that's why you have passive monitoring in place on everybody as a way of detecting early on something is changing about this person, and a red flag goes up, and maybe that person gets flipped over and starts having user activity monitoring on them. So you can actively monitor what's going on to see if they're doing anything that is potentially threatening to the organization. So you've got these two models and you got to pick those. Then you've got to determine what it is you're going to monitor here. And this is kind of very tactical here, and so I just kind of threw this up here. But you can see with user behavior analytics, you might be looking at things like when they log on. So a user that's just doing their job logs on at 9 and leaves at 5, and they're doing that every day. There's no difference. We're all creatures of habit. We show up to work at the same time with a few exceptions, and we leave work at about the same time with few exceptions. That's a good example. What they're doing with, again, file access, because we're worried usually generally about data. Are they copying? Are they opening? Are they emailing? Are they copying it up to a cloud storage? So that kind of thing. I mentioned the psycholinguistics already. I mean, there's more than just those things, but those are kinds of the things. And there's this step is a lot deeper than one slide. I don't have more than one slide to cover, but this is a lot deeper than one slide. You got to figure out what to monitor. In fact, if I remember correctly, there was a third of you had said, knowing what threat actions to look for, and that kind of comes into play. Maybe we need to have like another webinar on just that topic to talk about, where the threats are, what you should be doing, what are people seeing in actions that are used in data breaches and so on. Happy to do that at some point. And if that interests you, stick a note in the Q&A box that just as a kind of some feedback here, that'd be helpful. With the UAM, you can see there, it's real tactical types of actions. The keystrokes, the app usage, the file access, the web activity, and so on. The user activity monitoring tends to do two things, I think. And this is why you have to determine what you should be monitoring, because with user activity monitoring, you could go very light if you wanted to, or very heavy, meaning you're recording everything they do, or I just want to watch what emails they interact with and what they do with email. And as one example. And the thing with UAM is, one, you can use all that activity to help identify that there is a threat action occurring. That's one. And then two is it also provides context. And the example I like to use is if a user copies 100 Excel files that are sales documents of some kind, they're Excel spreadsheets, to a USB stick, is that good or is that bad? And the answer is you don't know. You don't know without context. So having UAM in place allows you to kind of look before and after the activity in question to get context. So for example, if you were to watch after that activity, that copying of the 100 files to a USB stick, and you saw a quick text message go sent out on Skype or something, and someone instant messages somebody else saying, hey, I have the files you asked for, make sure you bring the money tonight. Then you have context. It's bad, right? You got that. But then another example would be if instead, before they copied the files, you saw they got an email from their boss that said, hey, I'm going to be flying out of the country. I will not have access to any corporate corporate laptop or whatever, because I'm going to Thailand, or I don't know, whatever it is. Could you copy those files from last quarter to a USB stick so I can bring them with me? Right now, their boss asked for them, so you know that the action itself is now sanctioned because their boss asked for them, and whether the boss is doing something sneaky is a whole other issue. But you see how now we have context where it's saying that from the employee standpoint, they just did what they were told, so it's good, it's okay. And so you really need that context, and that's where UAM provides the value. And you've got to that also helps you decide whether you should be using one or the other, or really, in my own opinion, both. And then step 5 here is determining what you should be monitoring in the first place. Oh, I take that back. What do I have on this one? I have 2 other issues. It's about employee privacy, because we did ask about that. So this is on that same note here. And I have this creepy guy on the right here. I liked him because he's kind of like, you're watching me do what? You couldn't believe it. And that's because, you got people doing things like personal activity. So they're going on, let's say, under their Bank of America website, right? And they're looking at their banking, and you're watching that. And so you have to kind of think about that. There are ways, depending on the third-party solution you use, how to navigate around that. Things like specify websites that aren't going to be watched by user activity monitoring, that kind of thing. Or maybe what you do instead is you do user behavior analytics, which it generally doesn't usually provide any kind of identifying information. It simply only acts as red flags to say there's something kind of bad potentially going on. They've breached a particular behavior abnormality, like they're logged on at strange hours, or they're suddenly copying a lot of files, or they've turned negative, or whatever it is. And so you kind of think about that. And then there's the other issue of password privacy. where, again, someone's, let's say, logging on to Bank of America, you don't want to be liable having their banking password. That's bad. And so there should be ways around that. So you have to kind of think about that issue of employee privacy. And I know there's some questions already kind of coming in about it, so I'll make sure I answer some of those as well when we get towards the end here. And I've got, I think, two more steps. Let me look at my notes here. Yep, I have two more steps and we're gonna be done here. And then Mike's gonna do a quick demo and we're gonna take some questions at the end here. Step 6 is around retention and storage. This is really about, you're gonna be collecting all this data, and how long do you keep it for? Where do you keep it? Why do you keep it? That kind of thing. So when you think about user activity monitoring, uses behavior analytics. Behavior analytics tends to be a little less data, because user activity monitoring takes, again, every keystroke, every email, every application, the names of the windows that they open. What's a really good example? Oh, screenshots. That's a really good example. Screenshots alone take up a huge amount of space. And so there tends to be a whole issue around, well, how often do I take screenshots? Do I take them in color, black and white? Are they 64-bit? Are they 16-bit? And so on and so forth, just to kind of figure out how much data is going to be generated. Now, I'm not doing a how much data is it going to take kind of webcast here today, but you should know that there's a distinct difference in the amount of data that is collected and needs to be stored over time. The other thing here also I should mention real quick about UAB is user activity and behavior analytics is mostly about what's going on right now, whether or not what they're doing is an anomaly. And the only retention is really there as the baseline for the user. So if the user, just use a simplistic example, the user normally doesn't copy any more than 4 files a day. That's the baseline, so that when they suddenly copy the 1,000 files, that's bad, or that's at least strange. And abnormal, let's let somebody know. So that's one of the reasons for retention there. The duration kind of comes into play, and the duration really depends on a couple of factors here, and I've got them. Compliance, if you're worried about demonstrating, for example, let's say even SOX or HIPAA compliance or GLBA, I mean, the list can kind of go on, and UAM kind of comes into play there when someone is interacting with protected data sets. Compliance can be a big factor, because you can demonstrate. If someone said, well, we think that you had a breach, you can prove that you didn't, because you can actually show the activity somebody had. And this is probably more around UAM than it is UAB. HR might want to keep things for reasons, for example, that's one of the reasons I like to keep email around in some cases. In other cases, they don't want to keep email around at all, so that they have a policy that way. In case they get sued, someone can say, so-and-so never sexually harassed another person via email. Look, we have all the emails between those two people, that kind of thing. Or again, they don't want to keep it at all. And then legal, same thing. They want to be able to protect and prove that maybe somebody stole intellectual property, and they want to have a record of their activity. So it really depends on where your stance is, because some of you might be, we literally don't want to keep any of this more than 30 days. I'm making this up as I go along, or I want to keep it for 3 years, 7 years, whatever the case is. For, let's say, like GLBA, I think you got to keep it for 7 years, which affects the financial industry. The location as well comes into play. Are you going to keep it on-prem? Are you going to keep this data in the cloud? You have both of those options. I'm not talking about in terms of a product, but you have options. You can obviously keep data and copy it into the cloud for part of backups. And you got to think about the storage cost there tied in with the retention. If using something like, for example, AWS, they've got some great calculators there where you can figure out how much data you're going to store, which kind is going to be a cold, warm, or hot storage for the cloud, and how long you're going to keep it for, how often you're going to retrieve it. So there's some really great ways to leverage the cloud that way and try to do very, very low cost storage if it's something that you just want to keep for a very long time but remain static, never gets changed. And this is a really great data set example. And then the last one here that I've got, and then I'm finished, is incident response. And with the incident response, this is about something has happened. Now, this could be behavior analytics said, I think there might be something fishy about this user, or it could be user activity monitoring saying they flat out just stole some data, kind of a thing. It just really depends. And so what you're focused on here is these three aspects here. So making sure there's alerts in place to the right people, that there's a proper escalation plan, and then there's a review of the activity. And what happens, who's involved, who does these things, who's involved, what is the process, it's going to depend. I don't have it, this is not clear cut. In terms of on one slide, I can't give you a complete incident response plan. Doesn't work that way. That's probably an entirely different webcast for 2 hours at least. But it really does depend on a couple of different scenarios that will come into play here. You have the idea of if we're watching for potential threats, and I'll give you just a quick example. If I have activity or behavior analytics running, and I see that somebody might be a threat, like maybe again, psycholinguistic indicators, they tend to go negative. We want to start watching them. One of the responses could be you alert IT. IT goes to HR and says, we'd like to flip on the activity monitoring for them. We'd like to start watching everything they do. And then HR buys in, legal buys in, senior management buys in, and so on. And that bit gets flipped, and now they're being recorded, right? So that's kind of an example. And then maybe the security team reviews what they're doing. I'm kind of making this up as I go along, but that's what you might do for a potential threat. An investigatory kind of cause where there's actually a case where you think somebody is doing something wrong. That's probably alerting a security team. You again escalate through HR and legal, make sure that they're good, that you're going to review all their activity. Some organizations that do these kind of programs actually even have two missile key kind of mentalities where there is an account that can review user activity, but it requires somebody from HR or legal to kind of put in like half the password and like the security team to put the other half of the password in. And that way, no one person can just go and start snooping around and watching what people are doing. Role-based, I talked about earlier on, if someone's a different role, they're a high risk, that kind of thing, you might look at that and have different responses based on that person is interacting with financials. That's really big for us because we're a financial organization subject to a bunch of different compliance standards. Or it might be that it's intellectual property. See, it's kind of different, depends on the environment, depends on what you're doing here. And then the last one is those conditional ones, like again, if they're being terminated, you have a termination process. So for each of these four here, and I've got kind of here, you have to come up with a response plan involving those different teams. You'd want to come up with at least a simplified plan. And I wrote a white paper on how to do like the high risk exit. It's somewhere on Veriato's website. Maybe the marketing folks there can send that out afterwards to you guys. But that's for like that kind of condition. If you have termination, what do you do? And I wrote a paper on that recently. And so these it kind of depends on the scenarios. You got to map these out and figure out what you're going to do and come up with a game plan and how you interact with those other departments. Because one of the aspects of this is you're now going to be looking at, you guys mentioned to worry about privacy. You're going to be somewhat invading the privacy of the employee by reviewing their activity. And so having some buy-in there, escalating properly, just sort of deciding who has to approve that before it happens, and then who's going to do the review. Because the review might be done by, let's say, the security team, might be that person's direct manager. It just depends, and you kind of have to figure that out for yourself. So I think I've run over by a couple of minutes here, by about 10 minutes or so. So I'm going to hand things over to Mike. While Mike's taking things over, make sure you put some questions in the Q&A box. And if we need to run over the hour, by a couple of minutes to make sure we answer those questions, because I see there's a bunch that have come in already, we'll be happy to do that. So Mike Peralt, why don't you go ahead and take things away? And I think you're already a presenter, so go on, take it away.
All right, thanks, Nick. You guys should be able to see my screen now. So what you should see in front of you is the actual recorder settings for Veriato. What I'm going to go over here is what we actually do, how we actually go about recording the data that allows you to get into that user behavioral analytics. In front of you here is what we call the recorder settings, and this is kind of giving you an idea of the data that we're actually collecting. So from here you can see that we're collecting things like screenshots. We've got chat and IM activity, websites that have been visited, email activity, files transferred, keystrokes typed, program activity, user status, as well as document tracking and network activity tracking. We do have the ability to block some things in there, as well as set up some general options for each one of those settings that are set in the recording functionalities for those recorders. We can push this out through Windows. We can push this out to Macs as well as Android. We can leverage the application through the console here, as well as throwing things out through like a GPO or SMS if you needed to as well in larger organizations. Now, once we're out there, we've got these recorders sitting out there in the environment. We're collecting data on these users. So this is kind of where the user behavioral analytics starts to kick in. From there, we can actually set what type of anomalies we actually want to look for in the environment. We got a couple things out there that I've got set here, but you can see compromised credentials, document tracking, email anomalies. If I open up one of these just to kind of give you an idea of what the alerts are doing for the first instance, the compromised credentials. This is essentially saying, hey, there's a group of users that I'm monitoring, and for some reason, one user is logged in at one place, maybe the United States, and they've logged in somewhere else around the world, maybe in the UK somewhere. This allows us to set up an alert to say, hey, this user's doing something that's not normal from a user behavioral standpoint. Their credentials might be compromised, and because we've set up this alert via the action tab, we can actually go and send an alert or an email to whoever needs to get this email and say, hey, Tom over in accounting for some reason has had his account compromised. We might want to change the password or lock out the account until we figure out what's going on in the environment as well. Some of the other anomalies we could do out there's things like document tracking. We can compare users to themselves. We can compare users to groups for this type of thing. So what that essentially means is it allows us to go through and say, I want to take this group of users. I want to go ahead and monitor the types of activity that they're doing. So this gets into a one-off for the user, where the user themselves are being compared to themselves. So anything that is abnormal outside of what they normally do, we're going to get an alert for this information. So you can see there's things like count, file sizing, printing, outbound transfers. You can also see that we can monitor things inside of emails too. So if we want to take that same type of anomaly and apply it to a sent email, we could do that as well. You also notice inside there we got things like attachments, overall size, language. We also have sentiment. And sentiment is actually the tone in which the user typically responds or does things in the environment. And what that means is if a user normally is very happy, they're using the words like team and us and go, and then all of a sudden he becomes more like a I, me, and I hate this place. Maybe he's going out to monster.com. You know that the sentiment of that end user has changed, and we're going to alert you for that type of information as well. Right? And just like before, we can set up the sensitivity and then the action, receiving the email for that end user when that type of alert. So this is one way Veriato goes about and tries to be proactive and allowing you to see what type of things need to be monitored and maybe what type of things actually need to be taken action of in the environment as well. All right. We can do things based on keywords as well. So if you have specific keywords in the environment that you want to be alerted on, this could be a little bit more proactive, but it's usually a little bit reactive. This allows us to go through and say, okay, fraud alert information. We want to monitor these applications. We want to put these groups of users into that bucket that we want to monitor. This is the list of keywords that we want to monitor in the environment. And then we want to take an action of being alerted when that type of information comes about. These keywords that we've specified here, this essentially is going to allow us to go through and say, okay, if this keyword gets kicked off, send me an email. And then from there, we can kind of walk it back and see what actually is happening in the environment. So this is a little bit more reactive than it is proactive, like you would have with user behavioral analytics. But what this also allows you to do is get a report into that data itself. So if you are monitoring for keywords, you can actually take a look, okay, what type of keywords are high in my environment? And then from there, actually see who's actually the violators of specific keywords. And whoever happens to actually be violating those types of keywords, you can actually walk through the process of going through what type of screenshots you need to look for, what's happening in the environment itself. So this is a way to start the investigation process for that end user that is violating some of the policies that you put in place. Okay. Once you've done that, you can actually go ahead and store that data, set it aside if you need to. You can export this data as well. As you can see here, the recording piece of this is very much like a DVD, DVR type of recording. It allows you to go through and actually record and see things that are happening in the environment themselves. You also have the ability to go through and search for data if you'd like. So you can actually go through and search for things like the word confidential or whatever is unique in your environment. This allows you to see certain things that are based on those keywords that you've just searched for. They highlight them in whatever subset that you're looking for. So you get the emails, you get the keyword alerts. You can also have some file transfers. You can see their document tracking. Each one of these you can highlight, take a look at where that word is being utilized, and then once again get into the DVR process of seeing what's actually happening during that process itself. Okay. Now the setup of this data, if we want to go into the user behavioral analytics, we can see some things that are happening in the environment. So we can see that the behavioral groups are being created based on the UBA principles that have been set forth by us. So we can see what users belong into what group. So if we're going to compare a user to a group or user to themselves, this is kind of where we start to see where this process starts to take place. We can also see and have a list of the actual anomaly reports or activities that have actually happened. So you can see here, anything that's happened in the environment, I can get a list of this. I can get this sent via email. I can also take a look at each one of these alerts and see what specifically has happened and why we determined it was an anomaly in the environment itself. Okay. That was basically just a high overview of how Veriato 360 actually utilizes the user behavioral analytics piece. If you guys want to get a little bit more deep detail, feel free to reach out to us. We can get into a more direct demo, kind of a one-off for each person's individual business use case if you'd like. But for now, I think we'll turn it over to answering questions, and I'll kick it back to Nick to see if he needs to add anything to what we're doing as well.
Yeah, very good. Now, this is all good stuff here. So there's a couple of you asked questions around can I get slides? And so I'll leave that to the Veriato marketing folks to either send them out to everybody or at least make sure those of you that asked for it, we'll get a copy of the slides. That way you've got them. And I'm sure Erica would probably love a copy of slides, even though she hadn't asked for one. But all right, so a couple of questions here came in. If I'm going to close, I'm going to get rid of these ones here. So more of a comment on this one. Noel mentioned here, I see this is a great way to comply with non-repudiation policies during investigations. And I would completely agree, Noel, because in this case, you can't argue with a video camera, in essence, right? If one of the things that I'll kind of put on the Veriato hat for a moment, because I know the product fairly well. The Veriato 360 can actually record the screen, do screen captures, and you replay it like a DVR. So it's really hard to go, I didn't do that, when I can literally play you doing that. And if they go, well, that wasn't me sitting there. We can play it back, go backward and forward, and show again context before and after the activity in question, and show you were just emailing your boss 3 seconds earlier, responding to an email. So you think somebody else came, sat down, responded. It just becomes ludicrous. So yeah, non-repudiation is a really great point there as well. Melody had asked, does this only work for work use, or can this used for home use? There are products like that just for home use. You have to talk to the Veriato folks about whether it's for home use or not. But in concept, yeah. I mean, there used to be a whole line of thinking of doing this for kids and watching your kids online and make sure they're not being approached by weird people and that kind of thing. So that kind of comes into play. And then there's another question here about, am I required to disclose to my employees that I'm monitoring them? And so one, depends on where you are in the world. So for example, if you're in Germany, you can't. There are some strict laws against doing that. But if you're in the United States, for the most part, I don't know about any local laws, and I'm not the law expert, but as far as I'm aware, there are no laws right now that say you have any reasonable expectation of privacy when you're at work. Because you're at work, you're there to do a job. Your job is to sit down at that computer and do the work things, not anything else, but the work things. And if you're doing work things, then we get to watch you. And so in general, you don't have to disclose. It's not necessary in the US. As a general statement, there might be some laws, a state law I'm not familiar with, or a county law, or a city law. I mean, again, not the lawyer guide. I'm not one, nor do I play one on TV, nor do I stay at a Holiday Inn Express. But as a general statement, that may or may not be entirely 100% accurate. Let's call it 99% accurate. You don't have to disclose to your employees if you don't want to, but then there's also those repercussions of, what are they going to do if they found out? But at the same time, you may not want to disclose because you want to see their normal behavior and you can kind of catch them in the act. You want them, like Mike used the examples of, no more teams. I love the word go. You had the word go in there. That was a positive word you had, Mike, and I loved that. The team and go and us and we, and and they suddenly go to I, and they hear suck and terrible and hate. And you want to catch that. You want them to know that they can. You want to see that early on so that you avoid an issue. So there's that as well. Let me see here. There we go. So here, Mike, I'll ask you this one. Callum is saying our company has 20 members of staff. What product would you recommend? So maybe you can go that route real quick, just as one good use case that the entire audience could benefit from. So he's got at least 20 people they want to monitor. I don't know if it's 20 people in total, but 20 people they want to monitor. What do you recommend there?
Sure. What I would do is I would install Veriato to all 20 machines. I would turn on the monitoring piece and let it sit there. From a user behavioral standpoint, what will happen is alerts will get kicked off if anything out of the norm happens. Once that happens, then I would turn on the 360 part to actually start the investigation. And what that allows you to do is suck the data from those individual clients, put it up to the console, and allow you to see what actually is happening, and then from there you can determine whether or not this should be a real investigation or if it's just noise that's happening, and you can move on to the next thing.
Right. No, good answer there. So then the other question I've got here is, can I use employee monitoring as part of my security strategy against external attacks? So I've done a bazillion webinars, that's not an actual number, of course, on external threats, on security strategies, layers, defense in depth, that whole thing. And one of the things that I say in general is, as you're building an external security strategy, I guess I'd be sort of a protection, detection, and response type strategy around external threats. You should do it in layers, and you should do it in such a way where you are presuming that the previous layer is going to fail. It's much like sort of castle doctrine, where you build the moat, but then if the moat fails, like they get a boat and they can go across the moat, or they have really long poles and they're pole vaulters or whatever, right? Then you have castle walls. And then if the castle walls being tall aren't going to stop you because they brought the ladders with them, then you have buckets of hot tar. And if that doesn't stop things, it's not very accurate, then you have archers. So you're always building layers because you're presuming the one before it's going to fail. Not because it will fail, not because you hope it's going to fail, not because you think it's going to fail, but because if it does fail. And so this, to answer the question, long roundabout way to do it, sorry, is yes. This is one other way, because with external attackers, I mentioned 81% of the time, they're leveraging credentials internally. And Mike mentioning even just users and seeing when they do something that's anomalous. Certainly if a different user logs in under your credentials and was able to get them, and you're wondering how do they do that, they use tools like Mimikatz, where they go and scrape the RAM, and they can pull clear text passwords, they can pull password hashes, they can get Kerberos tickets, and there's all kinds of ways of utilizing that data and then gaining access. I mean, just a simple pass the hash attack, get a hash out of memory and a command line tool, and you can instantly authenticate to another box and never have to see the password. You just grab the hash and the username, and you're good to go. It's really easy. But that would be something that it clearly would be anomalous if they're logging on at weird hours of the day, if they start doing things they don't normally doing. That's what you want. That's what user behavior analytics is all about. At least that becomes an initial layer. And then the activity monitoring helps you provide context, especially, and I'm going to go full bore to like the worst possible scenario. You have a data breach. An external attacker comes in, leverages some credentials, breaches some data, steals data. Here's one of the problems. In a lot of data breach notification laws, they're written such that if you can't actually identify the scope of the breach, you must assume it's all of the records in your database. So if somebody comes and breaks in, and like that lady in Palm Beach County, she took like 10 people's social security numbers because there were 10 pieces of paper in an envelope. I'm making up a number, but it was something small. It wasn't 100, it was like 10. Right? But if we don't know that it's 10, but we knew there was a breach, we have to assume it's all 150,000 county employees. Think of how much money that's going to cost you. So if you could actually prove that it was 10, you only have to be responsible for 10, right? So if I have an ability with user activity monitor to play that back like a video and go, now they accessed these 10 and printed these 10 off, and that's it. You just proved the scope. Now you're really good with data breach notification laws. So I hope that answers your question here as well. Let me see if there's any other questions come in here. Lewis says, does this offer any monitoring? I think this is more to you, Mike, because it's saying this. I'm assuming Veriato. Does this offer any monitoring from outside? For example, if an employee logs into Office 365 from home but doesn't remote into their work desktop?
Yeah, though if we have the agent on their home machine, yes, we can only monitor things that the actual agent is sitting on.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the real trick here is, unless they've got a company-owned device, which is typically the only time an employee would let you put an agent on that's monitoring them, right? Because it's the company's device. That gets really kind of tough. And so if you were going to try and do something where you wanted to monitor what they're doing with, let's say, Office 365 remotely, maybe one of the things they've got to do is they have to at least connect to a VM, and they work on a remote desktop that way, and then connect to Office 365. Or it gets a little funky there. I know it's not a great answer, but might be something to consider. Arun asks, how effective is this tool in monitoring full-time remote workers? So we did talk about remote employees. About a third of you are worried about monitoring remote employees. Mike, what's the short answer on how this works with remote employees?
It should be perfectly fine. So we would actually store the data on those users' machines up to a gigabit of data. We'd also only store things that are relevant to anything that might be part of an investigation. Anytime we get over that gigabit or whatever you specify that can be stored locally on the machine, all that data is encrypted and proprietary, so they can't actually open and read if they ever do find it. But once that machine connects back to the network, it'll actually spit the information back up to the master console where you can look at it and read it. If there is anything that needs to be pulled up, if you've turned on an investigation or anything like that. So it should be perfectly fine. And a lot of our folks actually use it for remote monitoring of users most of the time, actually.
Very good. So there's another question here from Hugo. Mike, I want to just direct you to answer that, because it's not necessarily here on the webcast. It's about licensing and something specific with a problem he's having. But maybe you can either respond back through the Q&A or reach out to him afterwards and get his email address. But he definitely has an issue around uninstalling and licenses getting stuck.
Yeah, so Hugo, I see what you're saying there. You basically need to release the license. You're going to have to call into support, and support can actually release the license for you. It's not something that you actually have the ability to do. So if you call into support, they'll actually help you walk through the license release process.
Releasal. I like that.
Yeah,
That's
I do
awesome.
that a lot. I make up words.
Releasal. You made up a word today, man. You're almost in marketing. When you make up words, you're in marketing. We're at the top of the hour, but I see one more question from Arun. He says, "Does Veriato monitor mobile solutions, for example, an iPhone?" Mike?
Yeah, we can. We can't do iPhones. We can do Android. iPhones, unfortunately, are so locked down and containerized that we can't. There's nothing you can really do on them. But Androids, we do have an agent for an Android phone.
Excellent. So I think that that's all we've got for today. It looks like all the questions have come in. If you have a question, stick it in the Q&A box. Someone from Veriato will be happy to get back to you after today's webcast and answer that question for you. Hey, Mike, thanks for a great demo. Really appreciate that. And thanks for your answering questions today. Appreciate you being on the call with me today.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
Of course, as always. And you guys in the audience, thanks for your input. Thank you for the input on the polls. Hope this was educational. I know that I couldn't cover everything. It's hard to cover an entire program and what you're going to do in an hour. So tried to cover the salient high-level points for you. If you've got a further need, talk to somebody at Veriato. They've got a lot of resources that have been written over the years on how to do this kind of stuff. And I'm sure they'll be happy to help you. And if not, you can find me on Twitter and that kind of thing, and I'll be happy to help as best I can as well. So thanks a lot. And with that, we will end today's webcast, and we'll see you guys on the next webcast. Thanks a lot for attending.